Hi, Joanne. Uh, Hi, Joanne. Can you uh, bump me up to a panelist? Joanne, are you there? I I can't I can't use the chat. You need to make me a panelist if you hear me. Thank you. Joanne, you need to make me a host as well, a co-host. Okay. Good morning or afternoon, everyone. I think we'll get started. People are still coming on, but our panel is here, and we will get going. Welcome to Holy Blossom Israel Dialogues. We have a interesting program for you today with a new guest, and I'm going to hand it over to David DeWitt to give the introductions and get us going. David.
Thanks very much, Les. Welcome, everyone. It's really a pleasure to welcome Ambassador Scott Proudfoot, retired, someone who's had a varied and expansive career representing Canada as a Foreign Service officer in South Asia, in Africa, in the Middle East, and indeed in Canada at ICAO. And from 2016 to 2019, Scott was in Ramallah. Sorry, he was the Canadian representative to the Palestinian Authority, yes, in Ramallah, and resided in East Jerusalem. And so he's had extensive and intensive experience, both Israelis and Palestinians, and the international community that's responsible for the UNRWA Advisory Commission and UNRWA operations. I believe that Scott has four general themes that he intends to touch on, and then we'll have an opportunity for Q&A and discussion. So please do keep note of the questions you have so that you can submit them to the Q&A, and we'll make sure that there's an opportunity to raise them with Scott. The focus, I believe, is going to be on 4 points or 4 areas of concern. One has to do with Ramallah, and from being in Ramallah, getting a better understanding of Palestinian interests and attitudes, but also an appreciation of the PA. The third area would be UNRWA, always an area of concern, often of contention, and often of misunderstanding. So there'll be a lot to discuss there. And so with that, and hopefully ending up perhaps getting a roadmap towards a two-state solution. How's that for a challenge, Scott? Let me invite Scott to take the screen.
Okay, thanks, David. Can everyone hear me?
Yes, I'm sure.
Okay, very good. Okay, well, thank you. Now, but before we get started in the substance, let me just touch on something that, which is a legendary family connection to the Holy Blossom Temple. I was in London, Ontario last week, seeing my aged parents. My mother is 92, and she reminded me of this legendary connection, which it goes back to the 1930s. And 1930s, there was a dashing young doctor practicing in Toronto who was my grandfather. At the same time, there was a dashing young rabbi practicing in Toronto, and his name was Rabbi Morris Eisenroth, who later went on to be one of the leading lights of American Reform Judaism, but at the time was I think probably in his first assignment at Holy Blossom. And apparently, according to legend, they were doppelgangers. And you've got to remember that Toronto was much smaller in the 1930s than it is now. So the story goes that they were constantly being taken for each other. And as the rabbi was walking down the street, he would be hailed by my grandfather's patients who would say, "Hello, Dr. Scott." And as my grandfather was walking down the street, he would be hailed by Rabbi Eisenroth's congregants who would say, "Shalom, Rabbi." Anyhow, I had heard this story before, but in my family, probably like many families, there seems to be an unwritten rule, which is never let the facts get in the way of a good story. So I kind of, didn't take it that seriously. Sure. But when John contacted me about this, and I through the wonders of the internet, I actually looked it up, and indeed, I found photos of them both from 1935, and the resemblance is uncanny, separated at birth. So anyhow, for what it's worth, I wanted to share that little thing. Now, the title of this series is the Israel Dialogues, and I think when I've listened in on a couple of them, all your other speakers and your panelists, and probably most of the people in the audience, know Israel a lot better than I do. I lived adjacent to Israel for 3 years. I went there often. I read the Jerusalem Post and the English edition of Haaretz and Times of Israel Online, but it wasn't my beat. And so, my knowledge of Israel is rather superficial. I didn't speak any Hebrew, and I had few official dealings with Israelis. Now, there's much that can be said about Israel without reference to Palestine. Israel is a small but complex country with many different tendencies. But there's not much you can say about Palestine without reference to Israel, and that has to do with the power dynamic. So inevitably, I will be speaking about Israel, and as a shorthand, I will probably, when I say Israel, I will mean the government of the day. Although there may be also times when I talk about Israeli society at large, and when I do so, I will specify that that's what I'm doing. Now, as David mentioned, I'm going to talk about four things: the Canadian presence, the representative office of Canada in Ramallah, the ROC as it's sometimes known, about Palestinian attitudes, and the big question is, they're a partner for peace, about UNRWA and its mandate, and then why I think a two-state solution remains valid. Although I'm not sure I have a roadmap of how to get there, although there are probably some things that have to happen in order to get there. So first, the ROC. Now, I hope I don't get too down a rabbit hole of fine distinctions that matter only to diplomats. This is a professional hazard, but we call it a representative office and not an embassy for a reason. Now, it looks like an embassy, it walks like an embassy, it quacks like an embassy, but it's not an embassy because of one essential difference, which is that Palestine is not a state. So therefore, we don't call it an embassy, and that is a meaningful distinction, at least for Palestine, less so for the mission. The Palestinian Authority, which that office is accredited to, is more than an embryonic state, but it's less than a state. And the ROC is more than an embryonic embassy. But it looks like an embassy in many ways, and I'll explain that. It began as a mini mission back in 98, and then formally opened in 99, a few years after Oslo. And at the time, it was sort of a sub-office of the embassy in Tel Aviv, responsible for Palestinian affairs. But over time, it's evolved into a mid-sized mission, about 25 staff, self-standing, doesn't report to Tel Aviv, although it has to work very closely with Tel Aviv and with Amman, both on policy issues, but also on purely practical issues. Israeli customs, clearing people and things through there, paying our staff who are Jerusalem ID holders and Jerusalem residents, and of course on visits. But it does many of the things an embassy does in most ways: bilateral relations with the Palestinian Authority, political reporting, probably the biggest single role, informing Ottawa, interpreting what's going on in the Palestinian territories, engagement with the Palestinian population, civil society, academic relations, consular services to the fairly large number of dual citizens, mainly, but Canadians resident in the Palestinian territories. A bit of trade promotion, although our trade is minuscule. It's a small market, and of course, it's constrained by Israeli border controls. And then many high-level visits. Governor General, the Minister of Foreign Affairs, in my time, Minister of Foreign Affairs, Minister of Trade, Minister of International Development, Transport, premiers, mayors, parliamentary delegations, and so forth, who would, in some cases, be their principal focus, the principal reason for the visit was Israel proper, but they would add a day or two in Ramallah onto that program. And it has a significant development program in 3 areas, or it had in my time. This may have evolved a bit, but I think it's basically the same as it always was. One in the justice sector, building that sector for the PA through judicial training, other kinds of training, technical assistance, building law courts. We built 2 law courts in Hebron and in Tulkarem in my time there. And the idea there is to create the institutions that a future that are needed now for the PA to serve its people, but also for a future Palestinian state to be able to discharge its responsibilities. The second was women's economic empowerment, building up female entrepreneurship. Again, pursuing our gender-based foreign and development policy, but also finding a way of strengthening that economy to make it more viable. And the third one was humanitarian, the largest single component of that being UNRWA. And I'll talk more about that in a minute or two. And then there was the security coordination. And that was not directly under the auspices of the ROC, but we worked closely with it. This is Operation Proteus, which is an American-led operation, although most of the staff were Canadian. Because the Americans were constrained in where they could go in the West Bank, and we were not, which was providing coordination between Israeli and Palestinian security forces, but also strengthening the capacity of Palestinian security forces, again, to discharge their responsibilities in the security realm, police and so forth. So its main vocation, therefore, was, and actually I should mention there's one, when I said it walks like an embassy, it quacks like an embassy, the big difference is foreign policy, right? Because Palestine is not a state, really there wasn't a, multilateral issues and much of the sort of geopolitical issues that we might interact with a local government on in other countries, that was absent. But otherwise, very, very similar. But its basic vocation was to support the two-state solution by strengthening the fundamentals that would lead to a Palestinian state. So enough on the ROC. If you have any questions about that, we can come back to it. Then I wanted to talk about Palestinian attitudes and this issue. Is there a partner for peace? And I would argue there is. Now, I'm not tracking opinion. This is very impressionistic, and there'll be some anecdotes I'll share with you. People like Khalil Shikaki, do polling and track opinion. I'm thinking about more attitudes and assumptions. I would argue that Israel has a partner for peace and has had one for decades. Although Israeli governments have, that partner for peace has many weaknesses, but Israeli governments have, particularly of late, tried to undermine and divide that partner for peace. Now, first about the PA and its weaknesses. The PA is really the PLO in all but name. It's dominated by Fatah. It's evolved over the years in its approach. Initially wanting to reclaim all of 1948 Palestine, to accepting an extraordinary act of political courage in the 90s, accepting a rump Palestine, a fifth of historical Palestine as the territory that could be a future state. And part of that is that it knows, it's looking at the reality here. It knows that independence, that statehood, that a future for Palestinians can only happen with Israel's concurrence. And therefore it is working very closely with Israel. It is in objective alliance with Israel. And the security cooperation, which is very close, is only part of that. So much so, however, that many Palestinians accuse the PA of being in sort of the subcontractor of the occupation. And from their point of view, I can see why they make that error. I won't talk that much about attitudes in Hamas because I have no real visibility. I never knowingly interacted with Hamas. I have views on whether that's a wise approach or not, but whatever, we don't. So I had to, well, undoubtedly I did meet Hamas figures without knowing. And I talked to people who talked to Hamas. It's all sort of secondhand. But I would say that Hamas and Israel over the years developed a weird kind of codependency, an unspoken, they were never allies in the way the PA and Israel objectively are, but there was this sort of unspoken set of rules, and they were mutually convenient to each other. Convenient to the Israeli government that the Palestinians were divided, and that the threat from Hamas was always present. And convenient for Hamas because they could go on blaming Israel for everything and not taking any responsibility for the governance of the 2 million people of Gaza. And so, in the period I was there was sort of a tacit understanding between the two sides. They would attack each other, but always within, occasionally one would go a bit farther, but generally it was within a kind of an unspoken set of norms. Of course, on October 7th, Hamas broke the mold and surprised everybody. I think they even surprised themselves in how far they got. And we can come back to again how I would interpret that if you're interested. So beyond those organizations and those movements, where are the Palestinian population? It's hard to make a generalization, but one of the things I heard all the time from Palestinians of all descriptions was, and almost in the same words often, we're not going anywhere, and they are not going anywhere. They meaning Israelis. There's a knowledge and acceptance of the reality of Israel among Palestinians, which is deeply held. I'm not sure I've detected that same knowledge and awareness among Israelis, and it's not because Palestinians are any wiser or more virtuous. It's just the power dynamic forces them to acknowledge that, to recognize that, because they're faced with it every day, and they know that if they're going to make any progress, they have to work with that reality. But there is a lot of hopelessness and desperation among Palestinians, and this fosters extremism. One of the experiences that I'll always remember is meeting a group of young university students in Gaza, and asking them about their future aspirations. And there was one young woman who was clearly an outstanding student and said that she had thought about seeking scholarships to study abroad and decided not to do so. And I asked her, well, why ever not? She didn't do so because she was afraid she might get a scholarship and then be unable to take it up, unable to leave Gaza, go abroad to study at McGill or wherever that such a scholarship might be. And you think about the sort of the lack of horizon that young Palestinians have. And I think we need to understand that when we think about their attitudes. I was in a conference at the American Colony Hotel in East Jerusalem for the 25th anniversary of the conclusion of the Oslo Accords, and there were some of the Palestinian and Israeli negotiators gathered and looking back on things. It was really very interesting. And at one point, the doors flew open, and a group of young Palestinians burst in. They were incredibly well groomed. It's like they had all got fresh haircuts to go and break up an academic conference. And started to shout and turn tables over and make a fuss, and that was the end of the conference. And what they were shouting was, Oslo was betrayal. Oslo was treason. And from the point of view of a 25-year-old Palestinian who's grown up since the Oslo Accords, who sees no end in sight to the occupation, no horizon, and for them, the PA, they are interpreting it, I think wrongly, but nonetheless, interpreting it as that kind of subcontractor of the occupation. There isn't that understanding that I described before, and I fear that could be eroding. I'll give you one or two more of these sorts of impressionistic anecdotes. One is when I took somebody to meet a prominent Palestinian musician in East Jerusalem, and the person I brought them to meet them asked, would you play alongside an Israeli musician? And the Palestinian chap was silent for a long time. And then he said, I would like to, but my instrument is one I play standing up, and I can't play it when I'm on the ground. So I think there is a will. These are all just anecdotes. They're straws in the wind. But the feeling I had living there for 3 years, dealing with Palestinians of all stripes every day, is there is a will. It's not necessarily goodwill per se, but it's a will based on a recognition of reality that Israel's here to stay, and they need to work with it, whether they like it or not. But there is a sort of a complexity that also discerned among Palestinians, this sort of grudging admiration, an envy of not so much of Israel's success and prosperity, but of Israel's democracy, right? So this concurrent resentment and admiration. I remember one time when it was Netanyahu, I believe, was facing another one of his corruption investigations and potential prosecution, and Palestinians saying, I wish this could happen here. So I think there is a will. I think there is a partner for peace, but it needs to be found. A bit on the more political opinion. Part of the problem is Fatah is deeply unpopular, especially in the West Bank, partly because, it's delivered, not terrible government over the years. It's been in power for too long. And in any country, if you're in power for a decade, you risk getting chucked out in your ear, no matter how good you are. But more importantly, they haven't delivered the goods. They haven't delivered the independence. They haven't delivered a two-state solution. So, people are asking them, where is it? And then, of course, there's everything else. There's misgovernment, there's corruption, and all the rest of it. But it's especially in the West Bank. And I know Christians in the West Bank who say they would vote for Hamas just because they're curious at the PLO and they want the buggers out. And it's a binary choice. If you want the buggers out, you vote for the other ones. Gaza, harder to tell. Shikaki has done polling which suggests Hamas has and for a long time had a support of about a third of Gazans. I don't know, but I did feel even when I was there, and that's getting on 6 years ago now, that that Hamas was less popular in Gaza. Why? Because they're in power there, and were not delivering very good government, and Gazans blamed them for the situation they're in. And right now, one is seeing some demonstrations against Hamas in Gaza, driven by desperation among the Palestinians of Gaza. Now, UNRWA. I mean, we could have made UNRWA the single topic, I think, today, but I think there was a desire to broaden the discussion. So I'll speak briefly about UNRWA. I wrote a piece for Peace Now a month or two ago, and I'll reprise some of that. I won't read the damn thing, but I'll tell you what I said then, which is that UNRWA provides vital services. There are to 5 million people, mainly health and schooling, although there's other services as well. And in Gaza, it also provides food. There are 2 million, little over 2 million people in Gaza, most of whom are refugees. And today, of course, much of the infrastructure is destroyed. And UNRWA is an essential service provider not just for life and well-being, but for survival. For 2 months, there have been virtually no supplies going in. UNRWA has 3,000 trucks lined up to go in. It's not happening. I'm not that current on today's situation. After all, I left in 2019. But as we know, Israel passed legislation in the Knesset in October, I believe, which will render it very difficult for UNRWA to function, because it prohibits interaction between Israeli officials and UNRWA. Well, you need to have coordination to function, to go in and out, to do so many things, and it does not permit UNRWA to function from Israeli territory or from East Jerusalem. And of course, UNRWA is also facing a budget crisis. It has for years, but it's worse because many of the donors, including the United States, have pulled out. Now, UNRWA is rightly criticized for many failings. It is a creaky old institution. It's 75 years old. Its locally engaged staff are perhaps too influential. It has been reforming, but it needs more reform. And its governance is not great. I think it has to do partially with its age. It doesn't have the same kind of governance by its member states as most UN agencies have. It has an advisory commission rather than a governing council, for example. So that is one of the criticisms of UNRWA, and it's a legitimate one. Others, I think, are less legitimate. And one is this idea that it's a front for terrorism. Well, it isn't. Israel has accused some named UNRWA staff of having been Hamas members, even some of having participated in the attacks on 7th October. And this is quite possible. In fact, I would say it's even probable. UNRWA has 30,000 staff, 30,000 local staff, about 13,000 in Gaza alone. And the odds of probability are that some of them are going to be UNRWA supporters, and a smaller number, are going to be active in UNRWA. Well, in those cases, sometimes evidence was provided, sometimes it wasn't. UNRWA has done an investigation. It fired a number of them. I can't remember the number. as far as I can tell, um, according to strict HR practices, probably without cause, although I'm inclined to believe Israelis' accusations about those individuals. And I've witnessed some of this myself. Certainly since October 7th and the ground war, UNRWA facilities have been seized by Hamas, and they've operated. There's been fighting in those facilities, and that's not UNRWA's responsibility. This is against UNRWA's will. Tunnels. Yes, there have been tunnels dug under UNRWA schools. I've seen 2 of them, and witnessed in one case UNRWA filling it in with foam concrete. I don't quite understand foam concrete, but that's what they were using. You pour it in and it expands somehow. Another criticism is the curriculum. Of course, UNRWA has no curriculum. It uses the local curriculum. And in the West Bank and Gaza, that means the PA's curriculum. And the idea is that it's not supposed to be permanent. It's supposed to be a way station to the schooling being taken over by other authorities. And of course, it's supposed to also dovetail into tertiary education. And so they use the local curriculum. And, this was something that we, when I was there, had a lot to do with. And, ongoing dialogue with the Palestinian Education Ministry about the curriculum. I got to know one of the education ministers quite well. And the curriculum is not what I would want it to be, and not just on, the social studies characterization of Israel, some of which one could quarrel with, but some other things too. Referring to Israel and Israelis always as the Zionist occupiers. Certainly in the West Bank it's true, but that's not really helpful in creating a culture of peace. And in a sense, and therefore I would say the argument I made with Palestinian ministers, it really cuts against PA policy. You want a culture of peace. But the idea that it's inciting anti-Semitism, it's inciting terrorism, there's no evidence for this. One will see passages cited, and I'm sure there are people who will cite passages. And some of them sound a bit inflammatory. But if you think about the nationalist poetry of any country, you will see passages that kind of give you pause. This is not unique, and I think it is distorted and misrepresented. I think the real issue actually has to do with, it's a symbolic one, that it has to do with the meaning of UNRWA to both the Palestinians and Israelis, that it recalls the Nakba. And the reason we have 5 million Palestinian refugees requiring services from UNRWA is because of that, and because that nobody has lived up to the responsibilities, not Israel, not the Palestinian Authority, not the Arab states, not the wider world, to resolve this problem. So one could say, yes, it perpetuates the conflict. But of course, UNRWA as an institution has no role in ending the conflict. It has no role in resettlement. That's not in its mandate. And the other organization for refugees, the UNHCR, does have a role. But be careful about that. Be careful what one wishes for, because the first option for the UNHCR is repatriation. And I think we all know that, that's not in the cards. Palestinian refugees are not going back to Haifa, at least not in any significant numbers ever. But I mentioned that symbolic thing. I think it stands as a living reproach. Though, as I mentioned, everybody has a responsibility here. But it's a reproach to the sort of the foundation myth of Israel, the modern state of Israel, which is that Palestine was terra nullius, it was born by immaculate conception. Well, it wasn't. We have the situation for Israel and Palestinians to live in peace. Well, I'll come back to this later. A two-state solution has to be found, and this is a way of dealing with the refugee issue. And then UNRWA will no longer be what I called an inconvenience necessity. So this brings me to the two-state solution. I'm going to wrap up on this. Many say a two-state solution is impossible. I would say it's merely improbable, but in fact, it's got to happen. I've sometimes gone back to Arthur Conan Doyle, who put into the mouth of Sherlock Holmes the immortal line, "My dear Watson, when you have eliminated the impossible, whatever remains must be true." Now, that's actually a logical fallacy, but I think it's a useful way of understanding the issue here, because there are no alternatives to a two-state solution. Let's go through them. The status quo. Well, there is no status quo. I mean, it's constantly evolving. It's constantly degrading, and so it's going to evolve or degrade into something else. And it's not doing anybody any good. It's making the Palestinians' lives miserable. It's making Israelis' lives miserable. This cannot and should not go on. I don't. What's another alternative? A single democratic secular state for all its citizens. Well, that was actually the PLO's official line until before Oslo. I mean, and of course, many over the years, around the world, many ancient enemies have reconciled and learned to live together. So don't say that can't happen, but I don't think it's a solution for Israel and Palestine, and because many Palestinians would accept it. It goes against the very vocation of Israel, the raison d'être of Israel as a Jewish society. I just don't see how it could be possibly acceptable to the vast majority of Israelis. Another alternative would be Israel simply retaining the Palestinian territories, annexing them without citizenship for Palestinians. Well, we all know what that is. That's apartheid, and I don't think that's viable. For one thing, we know what happens to apartheid; it doesn't last. But I don't think it would be acceptable. It wouldn't be acceptable to Palestinians. It wouldn't be acceptable to the wider world, and I don't think it would be acceptable to most Israelis who cherish their democracy and don't want to become that kind of place. So, by process of elimination, what is left? A two-state solution. And of course, the impediments are huge. And I'm not going to give you a roadmap to get there, because down if I know. But a few of those impediments. Well, Jerusalem, the status of Jerusalem, and that could be a session unto itself. Israel's security needs, and they're real, but I think they're very achievable, and so the PA is on board with that. They're working closely with Israel on security matters. They don't conceive of ever having an army and tanks and planes and all the rest of that. And I do think that sovereign bases in the Jordan Valley would probably be necessary for anything that would give Israelis the kind of confidence they need to accept that. I see that as resolvable. Refugees. Now, the refugees, this canker, this what seems like an intractable problem. But I think this is negotiable. We all know nothing more than a token number of Palestinians are ever going to go back to homes in 1948 Palestine, pre-partition. But with the will, and this would take will among Arab states and among the wider world, and money, it can be done. And here, of course, I see this symmetry between Mizrahi Jews in Israel who deserve compensation for their ancestors' expulsion from Arab states in the late 40s and early 50s, who could be turned in to a constituency seeking peace rather than rejecting it if a global solution that recognized the rights of refugees both in Israel and outside could be achieved. The biggest impediment, of course, is our settlements, and that's the one which is cited most often. And indeed, not only are settlements are an impediment to peace, but I think in many cases they're intended as impediment to peace. They're intended to sort of cement Israel's control of the West Bank. But the good news is, and this is not news to you, but the vast majority of settlers, as opposed to settlements, are clustered along the Green Line. The residents aren't particularly ideologically motivated for the most part. They're looking for a cheap flat. Israel has a housing shortage. And so, those large populations in those settlements, since they tend to be along the Green Line, they lend themselves to border swaps, land swaps. I think this is soluble. What's a harder nut to crack are the hilltop youth and the highly ideologically motivated settlements deep inside the West Bank, and that's going to take real will by a future Israeli government to address. What's needed, among other things, is new leadership, and that's in both countries. I can speak more knowledgeably, obviously, about the PA. Mahmoud Abbas is 88. He's been 88 for about 10 years, as far as I can tell. The last time I saw him, I went away thinking, what a little old man, and that was 6 years ago. He's not going to be around much longer. And his dauphin is Hussein al-Sheikh, who's actually younger than me, but is seen by Palestinians as belonging to the Abbas school. I don't think that he's going to last long when the time comes. I think that you will see a step change at some point and a new Palestinian leadership coming in. And I hope it's one which is realistic and open-minded. And maybe we do get back on that road to peace. And of course, it'll take new leadership in Israel as well. Anyhow, I think I would stop there and let's have questions and discussion.
God, thank you. It was.
And so let me just say, I'm noticing I'm having a bit of problem here. I'm going to just move here because I'm almost out of power. So just stand by, okay?
Okay.
Okay. Oh, okay, let's see. Okay, very good.
Okay. We're all set?
Yes, hold on. My notebook.
Okay. Thanks so much. You've covered a lot. And some, I think we understand, are your impressions from having been there for a few years, a number of years ago. And some are obviously not just impressions, but based on your experience as the lead Canadian diplomat working out of Ramallah. Um, so that's very useful, and people need to keep those two things, I think, in mind when they ask their questions. And we are getting some questions from the floor, but before we turn to those, um, Mark and John, Les, are likely to have some questions as well. I wanted to start perhaps and ask you, since you are a former diplomat, you're not now retired from government service, and you've had all this experience. Um, when you reflect on current Canadian policy, uh, are there areas in which your experience suggests that Canadian policy, which many would suggest has been fairly static around requiring a negotiation between the parties to achieve a two-state solution, um, could be more proactive? Are there opportunities for Canada to play a more significant role in the pursuit of peace, recognizing that both Israelis and Palestinians have their national interests and are not going to walk away from them?
Yeah, I think so. You're right, David, in saying that policy has been static. Um, Certainly, the explicit policy, the policy document you find on the website never changed. It was written um, under Paul Martin or Chrétien. It never changed under Harper, and there might have been little tweaks, but fundamentally it remained the same policy statement. The issue was with the implementation of that, and one of the parlor games that Palestinians used to play and to embarrass me when I had high level visitors was to print it out and say, here's Canada's stated policy, and here's your voting record in the UN, and how do you square these two? Because we were, to be honest, voting in a way that was not consistent with our policy. And some of the things we did concretely, vis-a-vis settlements, for example, were not consistent with our policy. But Canada's role, I think, when there was an active peace process before my time, we were active we were the convener, the chair, whatever it was, of the refugee working group. That's the sort of role where we can, I think, usefully take a niche and do something, and would be well placed to do it. Right now, there isn't a meaningful process to support. I think there has been a tiny bit of evolution, and I think, in my view, in the right direction in the past couple of years. But I would be surprised to see any Canadian government taking any kind of virage and doing anything dramatically new in this area. Just for better or for worse, it's hard to imagine.
Okay, before I turn to John, let me just pull out part of a question that has come in from one of the viewers, Mark Grushkow. He said that he attended several peace rallies in Jerusalem and then noticed that there were no peace rallies in Ramallah.
Yeah.
Any comments? Everyone outside says that the two-state solution is the only solution, but what evidence is there that it is acceptable to the Palestinian people?
Well, evidence. Again, my evidence is purely impressionistic, but I think this is deep-rooted. There are those who nurse some crazy fantasy about liberating the entire. But I do feel that Palestinians are more realistic about this, and it's because they have to be, right? They see the power dynamic, and Palestinians tend to understand Israel better than Israelis understand the Palestinians, and that's normal. The smaller, weaker partner always understands the larger, stronger partner. Canadians know that vis-a-vis Americans. I mean, it's universal. So yeah, there were no peace rallies in Ramallah because there don't need to be. Yeah? The official policy of the Palestinian Authority is the two-state solution. This doesn't mean that I said there's a will. It's not necessarily goodwill. These are not warm and fuzzy feelings on the part of the Palestinians. This is a cold and realistic understanding that if they're going to have a future, it needs to be in cooperation with Israel, because, as they keep saying, we're not going anywhere, and Israel isn't going anywhere.
So let me just follow this up and then invite John and Mark. Again, this is the same person Mark has asked online, and I'll pursue it because I think it's not unreasonable at all to unpack this. From your knowledge, has the Palestinian communities, at least specifically in the West Bank, but perhaps elsewhere, actually been asked about a two-state solution? Have they declared a willingness to accept? This is a question that has been asked by a few people. My question is that there have been these conversations, that they have been part of it, but clearly an impression that they haven't been.
Well, I mean, formally, yeah, it's a good question. I don't think there's going to be kind of formal, there hasn't been a referendum on it, if that's what's meant. But the PLO, that is the official policy of the PLO,
right?
And it's one which more or less they have been pursuing. And there is now opposition, but it's opposition without offering an alternative. So it's I mentioned that group of youth breaking up that meeting to commemorate Oslo. I don't think they didn't offer, what are we going to do instead? So there's a lot of skepticism, a lot of disenchantment. There's disillusionment with the two-state solution because they don't see it happening. It hasn't happened. They're living under the reality of an occupation which seems to be interminable. But I do think that nothing succeeds like success, and if we start to see movement towards it, that more active support will crystallize, and maybe in both countries.
Ron.
Well, I'm going to jump in on this because Khalid Shikaki, whom Scott mentioned, and Dalia Scheindlin, an Israeli American, have been doing polling in Israel and in the West Bank, to a lesser extent in Gaza. And there has been a clear finding that both Palestinians and Israelis support the two-state solution. It's gone up and it's gone down over time. But there has been polling done post-October 7 that suggests the same thing. Israelis consistently say they support the two-state solution, but don't believe there's a partner for peace, which they've been told by Bibi Netanyahu, the same story for 13 years. And as you've said, Bibi wants to make sure that there's no partner for peace and has demonstrated it. But the Palestinians have consistently said that they support the two states. You can look at various polls over time, but they too, are skeptical about the sincerity of Israelis when they see settlements being built, et cetera, et cetera. So I invite our listeners to go to Shikaki and Dahlia and look at their polling. And as you say, both Arafat and Mahmoud Abbas have declared Israel's right to exist, which, needless to say, implies they support the two-state solution, since they also want their own. I want to just go back to one thing you said, though, right at the beginning, Scott. You said that the ROC, the representative office, is that because Palestine is not a state. Well, I think the reality is that Canada has not recognized Palestine as a state. 138 countries have recognized Palestine as a state, including Norway, Ireland, and now Spain, and they all now have ambassadors or embassies, or maybe they don't because they don't have them, but there are plenty of countries who recognize it as a state and have embassies, and Canada so far has not, although they had a House of Commons committee looking at the question of recognition earlier this year. And there's lots of talk now about the French and the Brits looking into this as well. So I just wanted to clarify that it's a question of recognition by Canada, which
Yeah.
I'm not
Although
saying.
maybe I should speak to that because it's an issue on many people's minds, and should we recognize Palestine as a state? Well, I would say that you can't magic a state into existence, right? And there are attributes of a state which go beyond recognition. One of them is controlling your own territory and controlling your frontiers, which the Palestinian Authority does not do. Canada has good reasons to be fairly stringent about the definition of a state. Yes, recognizing the Palestinian state might be helpful in some ways, but it's not going to make it a state per se. As I said, the difference between an embassy and a representative office is a fine distinction, which matters only to diplomats. But the difference between a state and not a state, I think, is more fundamental. And having said all this, and I would have argued up until maybe a few months ago, I would have argued against recognition of the Palestinian state. I'm now coming to think that even if it would be false, it might be useful to be a small contribution to creating that landslide, demanding change and demanding a two-state solution. But I think we'd have to do so looking, with our fingers crossed, because we know it's not a state.
Well, I'll just reply, if I may, David, by saying that the legal advisor of the Department of GAC spoke at that House of Commons committee and said that there are criteria for statehood, but that there is no requirement in recognizing a state to follow any of those criteria. And many states have been recognized when some were not followed. And you could make the same argument for Israel when it was declared a state. Its borders also were not clearly defined, and you can make the argument that its borders aren't clearly defined right now either. But it certainly has a control over its territory. Anyways, I tend to agree with your last comment. I think Canada should recognize it as a state, and I think Israel certainly should not have a veto over whether it is recognized as a state. But that's commentary.
I think we've got some questions in the chat or the more from the panel. David,
Well,
you're on mute. You're on mute, David.
right. We'll get to them in a second. So let's turn to Mark first.
Thank you, Scott, for your overview and perspectives and analysis. It's very interesting and helpful. I wanted to go back to the question of recognizing two-state solution and sort of the political, geopolitical implications and issues. One of the ideas that's been put out by a number of people, including Dahlia Scheinlein. She's part of a group that is working on what they call a confederation, a relationship that when a Palestinian state is formally created and recognized by beyond the 100 and some countries that have recognized it, that there be some kind of relationship, more formalized relationship with Israel. Obviously, Palestine as a state living next to Israel, there's going to have to be a continued integration and relationship on all sorts of levels, politically, socially, culturally, and so on, economically. And I just wanted to get your thoughts about whether the idea of a confederation between Israel and Palestine might be something that we should be thinking about at least in the long-term future.
Well, as a Canadian, when I hear confederation, I think of confederation. It's our confederation, which is, I think, a very different thing. Inevitably, as you said, let's these two states. Let's fast forward and imagine that we do have two viable states living side by side in peace. They are going to have very close cooperation on so many issues, on water management, on just, I mean, the list is, and so they will need institutions of some sort to help them with that. I suspect neither side is going to be really keen on a supranational authority that sort of, both are going to prize their sovereignty, but they've got to find ways. And, if you want to call it a confederation, you want to call it something else, but it's going to be very intense. They're going to be, each other's closest partner on security, on water, on electricity, on border management, on 1,000 things. And but I don't think, I mean, it maybe is useful as a demonstrator to show what the options are of how they could do that in the future. But I think that's, to get too much of a debate on that now is putting the cart before the horse.
Okay. Can I just ask one other thing about the refugee question? You mentioned that there are 5 million Palestinian refugees, and there's been a lot of academic work done about it. In fact, one of our dear colleagues who is no longer with us, Howard Edelman, Oliver Shalom, spent a lot of his time and energy in recent years on the refugee issue, the Palestinian refugees. He wrote a lot about it. He studied it very much in depth. I'm wondering, when you mentioned the 5 million refugee number, how that is determined by UNRWA, and how, there has been birth, of course, through generations since 1948, but in terms of defining what a refugee is, how does UNRWA arrive at that number?
The numbers are actually larger than 5 million. Those 5 million are the people that receive services from UNRWA. So you have a much larger number who trace their descent to pre-1948 residents of what is now Israel. And that identity is very important to them. You meet so many people who say, yes, of course I'm a refugee. They don't live in an UNRWA camp. They don't avail themselves of any services, but it's just sort of that memory is deeply enracinated. It passes from generation to generation. I mean, people are on their UNRWA books because their parents were, and as you say, there's been birth. There were 750,000 expelled in 48. Now 5 million on UNRWA books, more writ large. How many of those were alive in 1948? Well, a few. But living memory of that is less and less. And I know people in East Jerusalem who can practically see their family houses across the Green Line. But those are a vanishingly small number of the total. But the actual mechanics, I think your question mark is how do they do it? I'm not sure the mechanics of how how that status is passed on from generation to generation. I suppose, you know, a baby is born and you go and sign them up. I don't.
So just to clarify, United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, did they use the same approach to determine refugees from generation to generation?
Well, I mean, it can be, yes, under the Refugee Convention, which post dates the creation of UNRWA. And this is part of the peculiarity here. The High Commission for Refugees grew out of the Refugee Convention, which was later than UNRWA. But even there, you know, children born of refugees can inherit that status. But it has a different mandate. It has a resettlement and repatriation mandate, which UNRWA was never given.
Okay, thank you.
Les. Les? You're on mute still.
Thank you. I have one question. Just I'm also moving the cameras around here, so let me remove Mark. I have just one question based on your experience. I know you gave some anecdotal incidents. I'm wondering the conversations you had with politicians, Palestinian Authority politicians, off the record, just generally. What are they doing? I've met some of them as well. But what do they tell you about the solution? Do they really see there's a two-state solution?
Oh yeah, I mean, I wasn't directly talking to Hamas, but universally, this has been an evolution, which you wouldn't have found that 40 years ago. Some of them may be very hopeless about the prospects of achieving it, but I don't think any see any other solution. So, it's the way forward, and they know it.
And what power do they have? What influence do they have? I don't know. They are sort of elected officials, although the election was a long time ago.
Yeah, it was, I mean, it is within Area C. Hold on, I'm mixing up my areas. Any of the area directly controlled by Palestinian Authority. I'm counting backwards.
Area A.
They do manage day-to-day affairs, and they the policy as it stands hasn't evolved anything. So they get wrapped up in day-to-day administration and then lots of internal maneuvering, and there are 101 factions within the PLO, of which Fatah is only the largest. So there are tendencies, but I don't see a lot of divergence on this core issue. I mean, simply because it's staring them in the face. That they are forced to make that recognition, because the reality of Israel and of Israel's power confronts them daily. Every time they cross a checkpoint, they realize this isn't going away. The checkpoint won't go away, but they're reminded that Israel is here to stay. The checkpoint will go away if they can get to a two-state solution. But in many places in the highlands of the West Bank, you can watch planes take off and land at Ben Gurion Airport. You can see the skyline of Tel Aviv. Just the reality and vibrancy of Israel is there in their faces every day. A lot of them understand Hebrew. They have a good feeling for what's going on.
So let me pick this up on behalf of one of the those who've written into the Q&A. And by the way, if you're viewing this and you do have a question, please send it to the Q&A, not the chat. If you want to make a comment and not expect a response, then you can send it to either the Q&A and the chat, I guess. But if it's a question, please send it to Q&A. Let me ask the following then, Scott. You've talked a lot about your view that there's a clear perception among the Palestinians of the power differential, and that power differential is not going away, and it makes them, in your experience, understand that the Israelis aren't going anywhere, and that they would like the Israelis to understand that the Palestinians aren't going anywhere. But then someone comes along and says, but what about Hamas? What about Islamic extremists who capture and control resources and who are able to insert themselves directly into the dynamics of the Israeli-Palestinian world? That assessment would then lead one to say that even if the PA were able to assert a vision that the Israeli government responded to and said, yes, we see the necessity of a two-state solution, that an organization like Hamas will not be bought off by that. They will continue. And so then you get the response, both in Israel and among many in the diaspora community, that this preferred two-state solution is simply not on until there are no Islamic extremist groups, and the Palestinians themselves disavow that kind of a movement. And so, as much as I'd like to kind of accept this argument that you made about the significance of the power relations bringing in reality, there's this insertion of this other factor that it seems to me is a real spoiler and has been institutionally implanted. How do you address that? And with that, and this will wind up my question, is that the Israeli response, even to Gaza now, has been we have to reassert deterrence. Deterrence may work. We only know usually when it fails. But deterrence is aimed at states, government to government, state to state. Deterrence doesn't work against non-state actors.
No.
We've known that for 3 decades. So you're the Canadian diplomat dealing with the Palestinians, sitting in Ramallah, coordinating with your counterparts in embassies in the Middle East. What do you do? What's your recommendation?
Well, let's see. Maybe I'll start with the second issue of Hamas and deterrence and so forth. Yeah, as you said, you can't deter non-state actors. Israel's response to October 7th, I'm not going to speak at much length about this, but one of the effects has been largely to decapitate Hamas. But Hamas isn't going to go away because of that. It may be weakened, but it may be emboldened. There may be worse people who come up. I can see the desire to destroy this enemy militarily, but I don't see how it paints a way forward to creating a new. You're going to have more attacks from others, and one of the things that we saw even when I was there in Gaza was the emergence of movements worse than Hamas. I don't mean that. I mean not just Islamic Jihad, but Daesh. Okay. One of the things that led to a rapprochement between Hamas and Egypt was when Hamas started taking casualties in Gaza from Daesh, and the Egyptians started to say, well, we don't make much like Hamas. They're the Palestinian wing of the Muslim Brotherhood, but we would prefer them to Daesh. I could see possibly in the near future even more extremism coming out of this. People being driven to desperation. Those who are lurking in the wings, taking advantage of the situation, taking advantage of the relative weakness of Hamas. There are many tendencies within Hamas. One of the things that we heard a lot about was sort of the idea that this was a proxy for Iran. It was never even a proxy for Iran, but there was one of the many factions within Hamas seemed to have some sort of relationship with Tehran. So we're not any further ahead. Now, to your main question, I think, had to do with a legitimate fear that I describe what I feel as a partner for peace amongst what I would call mainstream Palestinian society and among the PA. But yeah, there is that support for Hamas, and it's there. But let's remember when the surge for support for Hamas came about. It was when Hamas won. It was because Palestinians were already disenchanted with where they saw the PA going. They thought they'd been sold a raw deal, that it wasn't going to happen, and that the PA were part of the problem and had failed to deliver, and therefore we're going to go out and we're going to vote for the other guys, and they voted for Hamas. So how do you turn that around? Is to start to make progress on a two-state solution, which will gather popular support for it in waves, because it will take away that sense that there's no horizon and paint a future, and that future will gather support, because I mean it's already been there. I think it remains there, but it's been wounded by 30 years of really no progress. I don't know if that answers your question, but yeah.
No, I don't necessarily expect a closed-ended answer to an open-ended question. John or Mark?
I guess I would say that while we're looking at Hamas critically, as we should, more than critically, and trying to figure out what the world does with them, and how to isolate them and minimize their effect, I think we also have to look at Israel and the Smotriches and the Ben-Gvirs, who are the same extreme, operating in the same manner of trying to eliminate the two-state solution. So we've got two sets of extremes, both extremely strong, not necessarily forever. One a violent terrorist group who claims that they want to destroy Israel, and the other a not so physically violent but pretty fascist group supporting violent settlers who want to take over all of Israel as well. So I think we've all come to the conclusion that compromise is what is going to be required. We're going to have the kind of leadership that is able to convince both sides that any moves to support those extremes is going to get you nowhere. I think you have to look to people like Petraeus and others who dealt with Daesh and Al Qaeda in Afghanistan and in Iraq, and are still doing so as to how to ultimately deal with Hamas figures and Islamic Jihad and others. But it takes two sides to tangle, and I think we have to keep our eyes on both sides. And one of them has asymmetric power. One of them could lead, could deal with settlements, could hold out their hand, could start the process. And that's one option anyway.
Scott?
Just I mean,
Mark,
to come
Scott?
back to David's question there, something else I'd say about Hamas, which was, I mean, again, I have very little visibility on Hamas because of this self-constrained policy we have of not talking to terrorists, which I think is a nonsense policy, but whatever, there it is. Hamas came out with a new policy document, manifesto, I can't remember what it was called, charter, in about 2017, 2018, which, you know, those sort of reading the tea leaves here and trying to dissect it, saw as being inching towards sort of the recognition of Israel. Now, you know, whatever happened in Hamas after that you know, the faction of Hamas that authorized and supported October 7th seems to have thrown that all out. But my point here is that no organization, no movement is frozen in time. I don't see Hamas as a partner for peace or a future partner for peace, but it doesn't mean they, as they are now, will be there forever. I mean, there was a time when the PLO and Fatah were dedicated to the destruction of Israel. And then they moved on from that, and they moved on twice. First to this fictional idea of a sort of a single democratic country where we all live together as brothers, and then to the two-state solution.
Mark.
Yes, thank you. I have one question I want to ask you, but I also want to make a point in not speaking with terrorists in terms of the Canadian position. If anybody, for those of us who are Jewish and have visited the Nova Festival exhibit that just opened in Toronto last week, it would be hard for us to imagine how any one of us or anybody from a Canadian perspective could negotiate or have discussions with Hamas, who did what they did on October 7th. Yeah. I just made that point. But what I wanted to ask you, Scott, was we have a new government just elected last week. And if you were still in the Foreign Service and a senior official in the department, what kind of ideas or recommendations would you be making to the new government with respect to Canada's policy towards the Middle East and Israel?
I think I would start by saying let's implement our existing policy rather than just leaving it on a website. Let's be meaningful about it. They have started to sanction settlements and settlers. Well, I think we should be more vigorous about that. I think we should vote in the UN along with our policy. I'm still not convinced that we should be recognizing the state, but it's certainly an option that should be there. I think we should have a more forward-leaning policy, but not so much so that it makes it impossible for us to maintain a meaningful relationship with Israel, or to play a role, a niche role in a future resumed peace process.
I want to pick up with the amount of time we have left. One last question from one of the viewers. It's from Barbara Landau. Actually, there are two questions here, but I'll give them both to you. I wonder what your view is of Marwan Barghouti being released and having an opportunity to lead the Palestinians. If we're looking for a new generation of leadership, and though he's not a young man, he certainly would be seen likely as a credible individual to replace the existing. And she's asking, really, do you see this as a wise choice? Though we know that there are some real issues. And second, she asks about your view on the Arab peace proposal, seeing that as a pragmatic plan for non-political technical expertise, where Canada may have a more significant role.
Yeah. Marwan Barghouti, yes, I think if an Israeli government wants to have a partner for peace who can deliver, That's the sort of person who could, right? You make friends with your enemy. You make peace with your enemies, not with your friends. Marwan Barghouti, I don't know him. He's been in jail the whole time I was there, but has the kind of standing among Palestinians that he would be able to make the unpalatable compromises that the Palestinians would need to make to guarantee, to address Israel's concerns and to and to leave order. I don't think he's necessarily the only one, but the name obviously comes to mind, and because he has that standing. So I was kind of hoping that he would be released at some point in the recent past. It hasn't happened. Maybe it will, but it would be a wise but brave move on a part of the Israeli government to do it. And I don't think the current government probably is so inclined. Arab peace process, yeah. I mean, I think it's I'm getting a bit stale on some of this, but I think this is certainly has elements that they can be drawn on, and Israel needs incentives too, and it needs not just sticks but carrots. And a normalization with the region would be a big carrot for Israel. And we started to see that with the Abraham Accords. That's now gone out the window. So I think it's something that needs more attention.
Okay, so just before I turn it over to Les to have the last word, Harvey Schiffer, who's written some questions in our comments, let me just pick out one, and it takes us back to a Canadian focus. And he's reflecting on the emergent divisions that have come forward in Canada on what is happening in the Middle East, particularly around Israel and Gaza, and Israel and the Palestinians. And while he's reflecting specifically on the Jewish community, where there's now division, let me pose it to you more broadly, as someone who's represented our country abroad in so many places, and is a Canadian and is back home. How, in your view, might we ease the differences, the divisions, not just within the Jewish community, but within a discourse in Canada? Is it the fact that we have not had a positive profile and an activist foreign policy that allows these things, that we haven't had a policy that has emerged from a serious Canadian debate? Or are these divisions based on religious or other identity factors? How do you see that as someone that does not come from within the Jewish community?
Yeah, I mean, I've always been surprised by the amount of focus on this issue in public debate, frankly. I mean, I have a reason to be interested in it because I'd served there. But why McGill students feel this is the number one issue that they need to occupy the front campus about, I really don't get it. And when people ask me about knowing my history, they ask me about what do you think about the war in the Middle East, and I say, well, which one? And I am just as concerned about other places I've served, like Sudan, than I am about Palestine. Yeah. But there's this fixation in the wider public in Canada that, I mean, I can, the Jewish community has an obvious reason to be particularly interested, but anyway, my point of all this is that this degree of uninformed attention in the wider public is probably making it very difficult to have that kind of civilized debate and a meaningful policy response, because it's also fraught and and the level of ignorance among people who feel they're entitled to an opinion just staggers me. somebody who asked me, who had very, strong opinions on all this and didn't know where the Jordan River was. And I think, don't waste my time. So, sorry, David, I guess I'm speaking from a frustration about how people have suddenly taken on this issue who never were before, and are not offering any. I mean, you'll find among people this idea that a two-state solution is nonsense because we need to liberate the entire. Palestinians don't think that, but a surprising number of ill-informed Canadians think that. So, I mean, maybe it's a matter of deepening public awareness. I don't know.
Anyone else on the panel before I turn it to Les? Mark?
I just wanted to say I agree with everything Scott just said. I think his perspective is one that I hold as well, and it baffles me as to why Israel and this particular little area in the world is getting so much attention when there are so many other incredible conflicts occurring in the world today, with hundreds of thousands of people being killed and losing their homes and lives every day, and we even as Canadians don't pay much attention to it.
Well, maybe that's John. You're on mute.
Jump in and say that we have a lot more Arab Canadians and a lot more Palestinian Canadians that we've ever had before. Mm. We have a lot of Jews who are very interested, understandably, in these issues. And I think as far as students are concerned, I think they have equated to some extent Palestinian rights with Indigenous rights and Black Lives Matter. And I think the fact that Israel is a democratic country, a country that we and the West brought into existence and have supported justifiably for most of its existence, and that there's 50,000 people dead in Gaza, I think that explains why this issue is on the front pages, and I think it should be on the front pages.
Okay, thank you. I always like to end with a provocative question. Les?
Thank you, David, and thank you, Scott, for bringing us some different insights. Our program have been a variety of different people and different experts, and this has given us some really current day and on the ground understanding of some of the things that you've experienced. So I really thank you for that, and hopefully you felt that it was a beneficial experience for you as well.
Well, I did. I enjoyed sort of getting refreshing my thoughts and memory things. Great.
I did just want to ask: have you been back to Israel since 2019?
No.
Just curious. Okay.
As I was leaving, I told the staff I'd come back to an independent Palestinian state, so I may have to wait a while.
Okay.
I think we'll have to do in the Israel dialogues is invite around a table to consider what a Canadian foreign policy in the region should be like.
If I may make a suggestion, I was thinking of somebody who would be a very good speaker, who would be Alan Kessel, whom John will know, our former political legal advisor, rather, a good friend of mine. He was my boss in London, recently retired, brilliant guy, and he wrote a piece recently on the genocide issue in the Toronto Sun. I don't agree with his piece, but I think he would make a really good speaker.
Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, well, let's wrap it up. Thank you thank you very much. Thank you to our panel for always the good questions. Our next Israel Dialogues is next Thursday, May 8th, where we will have Dr. Michal Chatuel Varachitsky, and her title is Beyond the Headlines, Understanding Israel's Legitimacy, Challenges on the Global Stage. So we'll be talking there again about politics and Israel globally. So I hope you'll come and join us then. I want to just briefly remind you that over the next month, you're going to be hearing a lot about the World Zionist Congress elections. And I'm not going to delve into why it's important now. We'll be hopefully reaching out to you and telling you that in a variety of ways. But please watch out for that. It is important for us as Reformed Jews to vote for the Reform slate to help the Reform movement in Israel. And you'll be hearing more about that, but just watch out for it. With that, thank you all. Thank you, everybody. We'll see you next week.
Thanks, Scott, very much.
Thanks. Oh, by the way, Les, I'd be interested in seeing what people said in the chat and Q&A. Is there a way of forwarding that to me, or can I? Because I think we're about to time out here. I don't know.
Yeah, I have no idea.
I think
But I will.
None of us are.
I will
of the digital
I will find
generation.
I will find an expert in our vast building to see how we do that. We've recorded it. We've recorded it. It depends on if the chats get picked up on the recordings. I don't know that.
I'll try and send them to you, Scott.
Okay. I'd be
Okay.
interested in seeing what people were saying.
Okay.
Great. Okay.
Okay.
Bye-bye, everybody.
Thank
Bye.